So Pete Davidson is an alleged comedian for Saturday Night Live, who apparently is also a big fan of Orange is the New Black, and stole Hillary Clinton's pantsuit. I don't know why exactly he's wearing a shirt that makes him look like he's picking up roadside trash on a furlough from the prison. But in any case, he was going after Dan Crenshaw, who's a congressional candidate. Dan Crenshaw also happens to be a military veteran who lost an eye to an IED in Afghanistan and then proceeded to go back for further tours. Here is Pete Davidson, an idiot best known for dating Ariana Grande. And now he will no longer be famous because he's no longer dating Ariana Grande, which means that his star has risen and fallen rather quickly. Also, just, as long as we're going after people's physical appearances, which is fair, because you're going to hear him go after Dan Crenshaw's physical appearance, Pete Davidson looks like he sucks the lifeblood from small children as they sleep. I mean, that's just, he looks like a refugee from a vampire movie. I'm sorry to break it to him, but as long as we're going to mock people's looks, let's just go all in on this thing. So the plot in which Pete Davidson is a star, apparently, is that he was a vampire who was arrested for the murder of a young virgin. After killing her and draining her of her blood, they arrested him and they put him in jail. And then they had him clean roadside trash, but he escaped to do bad comedy on SNL. That's the backstory of this clip. Here's Pete Davidson.
This guy's kind of cool. Dan Crenshaw.
Oh, come on, man.
Yo, hold on. You may be surprised to hear he's a congressional candidate from Texas and not a hitman in a porno movie. I'm sorry. I know he lost his eye in war or whatever. Whatever.
He lost his eye in war or whatever. Right. Yeah. But not or whatever. In war. To defend your stupidity. So that you could date Ariana Grande and then break up with her because you're a loser. So there's that. Dan Crenshaw, by the way, his response is all class. Here was Dan Crenshaw's response. This dude's an actual American hero as opposed to an undead vampire who has to hide from the sun because his skin sparkles. Here's Dan Crenshaw.
We don't need to be outwardly outraged. I don't need to demand apologies from them. They can do whatever they want. But I would like him and Saturday Night Live to recognize something, which is that veterans across the country probably don't feel as though their wounds they received in battle should be the subject of a bad punchline for a bad joke. And here's the real atrocity of all this. It wasn't even funny, right? It was not original. It was not funny. It was just mean-spirited. And that's how I feel about it.
Okay, so, good for Dan Crenshaw. I agree. And I'm not in the call on Pete Davidson to make an apology business. I don't really care about this stuff. I'm not going to pretend that I'm deeply disturbed. I do think it's indicative of a mindset of a bunch of people who have never met a military member, and it's obvious they've never met a military member. Really, it is one of the saddest things about American life right now is that a very small percentage of folks in the United States have served in the military, which means a fairly small percentage of people, particularly on the coast, have ever met somebody who serves in the military or are friends with somebody who serves in the military, and that leads to making jokes like that, obviously. And that's not meant to, none of this is meant to excuse anybody on any side of the aisle who does this. I ripped Trump when he went after McCain for his military service. So I just find this sort of stuff really off-putting. Although I will say that at a baseline, I think Trump has more respect for the military than somebody like Pete Davidson probably does.
Particular side of the aisle these days who are very angry at a series of institutions. This week we saw a lot of folks in the Democratic Party who are suggesting that the Senate actually be made it should be changed. It should be representative by population as opposed to 2 senators per state. This is because they're very angry that the Senate is dominated by Republicans, and so Republicans were able to appoint a couple of justices they didn't want to see appointed. So that institution has to go by the wayside. They obviously also don't like the Electoral College these days because of President Trump's election victory. Institutions all across America are under attack. Churches particularly are under attack from a left that believes that churches are trying to cram down a certain set of values, and thus they must be stopped. They must be stopped by the state. The state has to stop churches from teaching their kids actual, eternal, meaningful values. The state has to stop us from operating our businesses the way that we see fit. Our culture is under attack as well. the philosophy of multiculturalism that suggests that all cultures are equivalent, that they are all equally valuable, that if somebody comes across the border and has a different set of values, that value system must be taken as though it is exactly the same in terms of what it brings to the United States as any value system that has already pre-existed it here. And that's not a case against immigration, but that is a case against the idea that all cultures are equal and that all cultures are equally capable of melding into the assimilating melting pot that was the United States of America. Our history is under attack as well. There are two visions of history in the United States right now. On the one hand, you have folks who say that America is the greatest country in world history. They say that our value system is the greatest value system in world history, that the Declaration of Independence on the one hand and the Constitution on the other enshrine certain valuable principles that mean something and that don't change over time, and that we haven't always lived up to those principles. But the history of the United States is a history of a glorious people doing glorious things and falling short, but picking ourselves up again and moving toward the fulfillment of those principles. And then on the other side, you have a bunch of folks who believe that America was rooted in hierarchical evil. It was rooted in racism, sexism, bigotry, homophobia. America was rooted in all of these terrible power structures and power relationships, and that therefore American history is really a series of bad things punctuated by a few accidental lucky steps. That everything that is bad in the world can be attributed to America, and everything that is good in the world can be attributed to universal civilization. So landing on the moon is not an American achievement, that's an international achievement, but slavery is uniquely American. And this is the view of a lot of folks on one side of the aisle. When you believe that, for example, that you shouldn't be able to quote Churchill. This is a controversy this week. There's an astronaut named Scott Pelley, and Pelley had the temerity on Twitter to quote Winston Churchill. And then he actually was forced to apologize by people for quoting Winston Churchill, because when he said, "Oh, I didn't know that Winston Churchill was a racist. I didn't realize that Winston Churchill stood for atrocities." Now, he didn't know anything about Winston Churchill, so he just took everything that was being said about Winston Churchill at face value. Suffice it to say, all of the social justice warrior 17-year-olds who were very angry at Scott Kelly for quoting Winston Churchill would be speaking German if it weren't for Winston Churchill. But that doesn't really matter these days. All that matters, according to a lot of folks on one side of the aisle, is that our history is a history of sin. George Washington was not the father of our country or a great man. He was a slaveholder. Abraham Lincoln was not the man who preserved the Union and ensured that the blessings of the Constitution and the guarantees of the Constitution were applied to black folks in the United States. Abraham Lincoln was a racist who originally wanted to recolonize black folks from the United States back into Africa, and so he has to be thrown out as well. We can always dig up something historically that makes people look like anachronisms are terrible. It's really not hard to do that, because the history of the world is filled with bad ideas. The question is, why is America such a great place? And the answer is because America is filled with great ideas and was always filled with great ideas. But there's one side of the aisle that doesn't believe that. Well, if you have that fundamental disagreement, there's no way to bridge that gap. And finally, there is just an enormous amount of personal dislike in our society right now. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that people don't actually hang out with each other all that much outside of places like church. So if you don't go to church with somebody, the chances that you're hanging out with them outside of church are actually pretty low. There's a famous sociologist from Harvard named Robert Putnam. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone. He pointed out that in the 1950s, the number one growth area in the American economy was bowling alleys. That bowling alleys were popping up everywhere. Why? Because every single person was basically a member of a bowling league. Now, very few people overall are members of bowling leagues, and so you've seen all these bowling alleys shut down. Instead, we have fake friendships on social media, or we have text, or we have phone, but very few people are actually spending the amount of time with one another to allow them to supersede the vision they have of the other person. It's fascinating how personal contact with other people actually allows you to see people in a better light. There's a famous study that was done in the 1930s, a really kind of interesting study, in which these scientists went around, social scientists went around the United States. They were Asian. And they went around the United States, and they stayed at a bunch of different hotels. And no problem. The folks let them in. They were allowed to stay at all these various hotels. Then they called up the hotels on the phone, and they said, "Do you allow Asian people to stay in your hotels?" And virtually all of these hotels that they just stayed at said, "No, we don't allow Asian people to stay at the hotels." What changed is that they actually showed up, and they had a face-to-face conversation with someone, and things changed. That's fallen by the wayside as well. So hatred, antipathy, anger at each other, this is at highs that we haven't really seen in the United States since the 1960s at the very least. Now, the question is why? I think the actual reason is because of the decline of Judeo-Christian values in our society. I think Judeo-Christian values have taken a real 2x4 to the face. I think that the values that were embedded in biblical living have basically been thrown out in favor of this new idea that secular humanism is going to save all of us. The only problem with that is that secular humanism has not actually saved all of us. Because secularism inherently does not give us the fundamental basis for why human beings have value. The most important single sentence ever written in human history, and in my opinion, and I'm sure most of the people in this room, wasn't written by humans. The single most important sentence is that man was made in God's image. Right? That is the single most important verse in the Bible, in my view. It is the single most important image in the history of mankind, is that human beings have innate value. And that innate value is what you can build on. You can build on that. But we have decided that we don't need the Bible for that anymore. Reason can bring us to it. The only problem, of course, is that reason cannot bring you to that. Reason can bring you to a lot of places, but it can't bring you to the inherent value of each individual human being. Because it turns out that for most of human history, people didn't believe that. For most of human history, people enslaved one another because they didn't believe every individual had value. For most of human history, men thought that women were lesser beings. For most of human history, people thought that people of different tribes and different races did not have these same sorts of value. It took a revelation for that to be understood by human beings. And without that revelation, everything collapses into dust.